This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Stop me if you've heard this one before. A very wealthy philanthropist announced a big ticket donation.
Do you plan to give away the majority of your wealth in your lifetime?
Yeah, I do.
Headlines roll in about how massive the donations are.
Well, move over, Santa Claus. Jeff Bezos is coming to town.
Then backlash trickles in from critics accusing the donors of just getting some nice tax write-offs or nice PR.
And then, the rest of the week was Jeff Bezos doing this big song and dance about philanthropy, while then an hour later, his company lays off thousands of people.
And to be clear, this isn't just about Bezos. It's a conversation we've heard over and over again. While we can pretty much agree charity and philanthropy are spurred by great intentions, we can't seem to agree on whether philanthropy from millionaires and billionaires is always a good thing. So let's look at how something as seemingly simple as a donation can actually be so complicated and so controversial. There are a number of tools and incentives in place that wealthy donors can use for philanthropy. Let's focus on some of the biggest ones over here, starting with private foundations. This is the system philanthropists like Bill and Melinda French Gates use when making huge donations to their own foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There's nothing insidious about donating to your own foundation per se, but skeptics will point out this is a pretty effective way to pay less income and capital gains taxes on your wealth and avoid estate taxes altogether, since the funds are no longer part of your estate. In one notorious example back in 2014, Nicholas Woodman, the founder and CEO of GoPro, announced he would be making a $500 million donation to a new Jill and Nicholas Woodman Foundation. The donation was made using company shares. 4 years later, the New York Times found there was no trace of the foundation or the $500 million that got donated. The Times did note that the donation came at a pretty convenient time. GoPro went public in 2014, and by donating $500 million worth of stock, Woodman would have avoided paying capital gains tax. The foundation's assets were supposedly housed in another item on our list here, which brings us to donor-advised funds, or DAFs. It's another controversial method of big-ticket philanthropy. DAFs act like a big checking account that donors can pool any assets into, from cash to stock to real estate and more, and it lets donors distribute those assets over time. There's no deadline for these accounts to actually distribute the funds to the charities waiting on them. The donated funds can sit in the account unused for an unlimited amount of time. Meanwhile, the donor gets the tax benefits immediately. The donor also usually retains complete control over how the assets are used, and funds only get distributed by their request. Contributions to DAFs have been steadily climbing for the last few years, jumping from about $30 billion in 2017 to almost $73 billion in 2021. But the payout rates from those DAFs remain pretty stagnant, hovering around 23% in recent years and rising to 27% last year. DAFs are an increasingly popular tool for wealthy philanthropy, particularly with Silicon Valley giants like Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Jack Dorsey. Proponents argue they can be useful in giving donors time to decide how to distribute the funds. But some critics, including fellow philanthropists, have been speaking out for more incentives or regulation to force the DAFs to distribute donations by a certain time. So, private donations and DAFs are some of the most popular tools for major philanthropic gifts, but there's one more tool we need to mention, and it's perhaps the most controversial one here: 501c4 nonprofits. These are civic groups that fund social and political causes, and crucially, they have no obligation to disclose their donors. You might have heard the term dark money before, which refers to this kind of political spending where the source is undisclosed. Now, it's important to remember big donations to groups pushing social causes can lead to positive outcomes. For example, reproductive health care and modern contraception worldwide is almost exclusively funded through billionaires and billionaire-funded research, not public. This is an area where private philanthropy can be uniquely useful. In the US and around the world, governments can sometimes refuse to support or even openly attack reproductive health care. But these groups can just as easily help billionaires dictate public policy even more than voters can, all through the use of donations. Bill Gates spelled this out most clearly back in 2012 when asked if he would run for president instead of continuing as a philanthropist.
I actually think, maybe I'm wrong, that I can have as much impact in that role as I could in any political role. I don't have to raise political campaigns. I don't have to try and get elected. I'm not term limited to 8 years. It's a very nice office.
Billionaire philanthropy has the potential to be hugely impactful, but there's always ambiguity of who's really benefiting from the donations. It's worth keeping all this context in mind the next time you see headlines of high-profile donations from billionaires and how it might be different from the ways an average American like you or me chooses to give back to the causes we care about. Dedicated to analyzing and providing info on charities and their efficacy, Lori, thank you so much for joining us. There are so many new ways to send donations these days, like fundraising websites or apps like Venmo and Cash App. What are some ways people can navigate all these platforms, all these new platforms, and make sure their donations are going where they're supposed to?
Well, there's really a lot of layers to this because there is the medium through which you donate, which there's a lot of traps and things to be aware of in that regard. And then, of course, there is identifying efficient and effective charities to support, which is the next step of making sure that when you do donate, even if it does get to the intended recipient, is that charity going to use your donation the way that they say they are? So in terms of how to donate, one of the safest ways to do it is with a credit card. If you realize after the fact that you made a mistake, it's really tough to get your money back in your account once you've already conveyed it to someone. Whereas with a credit card, you have an opportunity to dispute the charge if you later find out that it didn't go where you thought it was going to go. The number one question that we get here at Charity Watch is this particular organization legit? And I try to warn people that legitimate just means that the charity is registered with the IRS and state agencies to be allowed to exist and to solicit you. It doesn't necessarily mean that your donation will be used efficiently. Under law, charities can spend as little as 1% of your donation on their programs and the rest on overhead and be quote unquote legitimate. The IRS does have an online search that you can make sure that the charity is legit in that sense. From there, you do want to make sure that you are identifying charities that are actually going to spend your donation primarily on programs and keep their overhead reasonable. We're one resource at charitywatch.org. We have a list of top-rated charities organized by cause, and these are charities that spend at least 75% or more of your donations on their programs, and they're really keeping their overhead costs under control, and they also have good governance and transparency benchmarks.
What's one last piece of advice you wish most Americans would keep in mind this holiday season as they might be thinking of ways to be giving back?
A lot of us, especially those of us who are altruistic and giving types of people, the very types of people who donate to charity, we can have a lot of trouble saying no when we're asked to donate. And so my elevator pitch that I always give to people when I only have a moment to give them giving advice is be proactive. When we react to someone asking us to donate, we make mistakes because we're doing it without thinking. We're often under pressure and donating before we have time to investigate to see if a charity is legitimate, if it is using donations well. And so by being proactive, you can in advance decide, what can I afford? What causes do I care the most about? And then which charities working in those causes have not only the types of programs that I'm interested in funding, but are going to use the vast majority of my donation on those programs and keep their overhead under control.
We'll call that intentional altruism. Intentional, purposeful altruism. Folks,
I like that. I think you just coined a new phrase.
Feel free to use that. Lori, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this.
Thanks so much for having me.